At an elegant table, surrounded by luxury and impeccable appearances, a woman was silently destroyed by laughter and judgments that seemed harmless, but were not. Before a cold husband and a family convinced of their superiority, she heard everything without reacting, as if accepting the fate they had already decided for her. What no one realized is that, behind that silence, there existed absolute control of the situation, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself. And when the truth finally came to light, there was no room left for pride, only for the crushing weight of the error. Before discovering how a simple dinner turned into the greatest humiliation and the most impactful twist. Don't forget to subscribe for more surprising stories. The table was set with the meticulousness of someone who needs to prove something. Murano crystals reflected the light of imported chandeliers, and the aroma of a dinner prepared by a hired chef filled every corner of the apartment in Itaim Bibi. It was one of the most valued addresses in São Paulo, one of those penthouses that appear in architecture magazines with carefully lit photos and no marks of real life. Everything there had been designed to impress, and everyone there knew it except perhaps the woman sitting at the center of the long table with the posture of someone who does not need a scenery to occupy space. Beatriz Fontes was 42 years old and carried each one of them with a serenity that deeply bothered those who looked at her. It wasn't beauty, although she was beautiful, nor elegance, although she never seemed out of place. It was something else, something harder to name, a kind of dense presence like that of someone who knows exactly where they are and why. Around her, the Drummond family displayed the usual choreography. Renato, her husband, at the head of the table, in the suit he used only when he wanted to seem more important than he was. Donna Lourdes, her mother-in-law, in a genuine pearl necklace and a smile that never reached her eyes. Fabio, a lawyer brother-in-law with the particular arrogance of someone who studied at a private university and believes that equates to wisdom. And Claudia, a sister-in-law who laughed before the joke ended and agreed with everything her brother said. Beatrice had known each of them for 15 years, and in 15 years nothing had ever changed in those people. So she came. Renato's voice had that calculated lightness of someone who rehearsed cruelty so it would seem casual. I thought maybe you had cancelled. You always have some mysterious commitment, don't you, Bay? Beatrice raised her eyes from the water glass. She did not answer immediately. This pause, she knew, was unbearable for him. Commitments exist to be fulfilled, Renato, she said with a firm voice and no warmth, just like agreements. Donna Lourdes coughed discreetly and repositioned the napkin on her lap. It was her gesture to signal discomfort without having to admit it. Fabio served himself more wine, as if the conversation already bored him, and Claudia looked at her plate with the smile of someone who holds information they are yet to use. The dinner had been summoned by Renato with unusual formality, an invitation by message, no call, no prior conversation. Just, Wednesday, 8 o'clock at night. We need to resolve the matter once and for all. The whole family will be there. Beatrice reread the message 3 times, not out of doubt but out of curiosity. She knew what was coming. She had known for longer than Renato imagined. The first courses arrived with silent efficiency. Asparagus risottos, carpaccio appetizer, artisanal bread with truffled butter, everything expensive, everything designed to say, we are the ones who have, and you are not. How is your consulting work going? Claudia asked, with the intonation of someone placing invisible quotation marks around a word. Still with those small clients? Beatrice cut a piece of the carpaccio with precision. The clients are fine, thank you. It must be difficult, Claudia continued, without waiting for an invitation to proceed. Maintaining a portfolio like that, without structure, without a real office, I wouldn't have the patience. Fortunately, Beatrice replied, bringing the fork to her mouth, each person has the patience that their work requires. Fabio let out a short laugh through his nose. Donna Lourdes rearranged her necklace. Renato watched attentively, as if measuring the right moment for the next stage of the night. And the moment came between the main course and dessert, when the silence became dense enough to be exploited. Renato stood up from his chair with that slowness, of someone who wants everyone to pay attention. He opened his jacket, took out a thick beige envelope, closed with a seal, and placed it on the white tablecloth in front of Beatrice with a gesture that wanted to be definitive. "I thought it was better to do this here," he said with a voice slightly too controlled, "in the presence of the family, so that there are no doubts later, nor different versions of what happened." Beatrice did not touch the envelope. She looked at him, then at the envelope, then back to Renato. "They are the papers," he said, when he realized she was not going to ask. "I know what it is," she replied. "Fabio reviewed everything. It is a fair agreement. You keep the apartment in Perdizes, the car, and an amount that will give you time to reorganize." He made a brief pause, probably rehearsed. "Considering that you never contributed financially in a significant way to what we built together, I think it is more than reasonable." Donna Lourdes nodded her head as if confirming a sentence she herself had helped draft. "You will be fine, Beatrice," said the mother-in-law with that tone of someone who wants to seem generous while closing a door. "Renato was always very careful with these matters. You will not lack for anything." Claudia's laughter came along with a whispered comment to Fabio, low enough to seem discreet, loud enough to be heard. "She never really worked anyway. It's the best she could expect." Beatrice took a deep breath. Not out of anger. It was a breath of recognition, that of someone who confirms a hypothesis they had already tested before. She picked up the envelope, opened it carefully, read each page with attention that no one expected from that situation. While she read, the conversation around her continued, with comments about the apartment in Perdizes, about how much it would cost to renovate it to sell, about the car that was old and would need to be changed soon anyway. Words that mixed, overlapped, each of them carrying the same message underneath. You don't have much to lose, because you never had much. Beatrice finished reading, folded the pages carefully one by one and put them back inside the envelope. Then she asked the waiter for a pen, who brought it in a matter of seconds. She signed where it was necessary, without haste, without hesitating, with the signature of someone who was not signing a defeat, but ending a cycle that had already completed itself a long time ago. She returned the envelope to Renato, stood up from the chair, picked up her bag naturally. "I hope the rest of the night is pleasant for you," she said, and then, already near the exit, she stopped. She turned slightly, with her gaze going straight to Renato. "Ah," she spoke with a calmness that cut more than any volume of voice. "It would be interesting if you watched the news tomorrow morning. Open channel will do." Claudia opened her mouth for some comment. Renato frowned. Donna Lourdes let slip a crooked smile. Beatrice did not wait for the answer. She left. The sound of her heels on the marble floor faded until it disappeared, and the apartment became for a moment strangely quiet. Afterwards the laughter returned, and with it the comfortable certainty that they knew very well who that woman was, or so they believed. Thursday morning arrived in São Paulo, with that grey luminosity that the city uses when it wants to seem indifferent. In the penthouses of Itaim Bibi, the sun was still fighting against the low clouds when Renato Drummond got out of bed at 7:20, with the satisfaction of someone who had slept well after resolving a matter pending for a long time. In the kitchen, the maid had already prepared coffee and pão na chapa, grilled bread. The apartment had the silence of places where no one truly talks, only coexists. Renato turned on the television while waiting for his espresso, with the remote control pointed at the 85-inch set that occupied almost the entire living room wall. He chose the economic news channel out of habit. It was what he always watched in the morning, a routine of a man who likes to feel informed. In the first few minutes, nothing different. Indices from the previous day, international market analysis, commentary on the exchange rate. Renato messed with his phone while listening, answering messages from the family group, where Fabio had already sent an audio saying that Beatrice had signed without resistance, that the lawyer would confirm the protocol still that week, and that the chapter was, finally, closed. Donna Lourdes responded with a heart emoji. Claudia sent, "I knew it was going to be that easy." Renato was typing his own response when the presenter's voice changed tone. He did not look up immediately. It was the word that made him stop. A consolidation of one of the most significant business operations of the last 5 years in Brazil. Fontes Capital, an investment holding company headquartered in São Paulo and with a presence in 11 countries, confirms this morning the conclusion of the IPO process on the New York Stock Exchange in one of the largest initial public offerings ever carried out by a company of Brazilian origin. The founder and main shareholder, Beatriz Fontes, now appears among the 50 richest individuals in the country with an estimated net worth. Renato looked up. On the screen, a photograph of Beatriz. Not the photograph of the woman who had walked out of his door the night before with a discreet leather bag and no words of farewell. It was a different photograph. The same woman, but with a look that he recognized and at the same time had never seen before. Direct, calculated, calm, in the way that is only possible for someone who does not need anyone's approval. The espresso went cold in the cup. He stood motionless before the television for how long he could not say. The information kept coming through the presenter's voice, data, percentages, names of companies that integrated the holding, sectors of activity that ranged from financial technology to port infrastructure. Fontes Capital had not appeared yesterday. It had appeared 14 years ago, which meant it existed before the marriage, during the marriage, and would continue to exist after. 14 years. Renato tried to do the mental calculation of how many times, in those 14 years, he had referred to Beatriz's work as those consultancies of hers, as if it were something minor, tolerated, an occupation to fill the time of a woman who didn't have much else to do. He tried to remember how many times he had interrupted a call of hers, with a gesture of impatience because she was on the phone with clients again. He tried to recall how many times Dona Lourdes had suggested, in front of Beatriz, that an executive's wife didn't need to exert herself so much in a career because the husband already supported the family's standard of living. The phone in his hand vibrated. It was Fabio. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Then Claudia. "Renato, call me. Now." Then Dona Lourdes, who did not send a message but called directly, and the call rang 3 times before Renato realized he had the device in his hand. Son, his mother's voice had a texture he rarely heard, something between daze and an attempt to maintain control. "Are you watching?" "I'm seeing it," he replied. "That woman," said Dona Lourdes, and stopped in the middle of the sentence as if the following words had gotten stuck somewhere before reaching her mouth. On the television, the coverage advanced. A reporter was live in front of the Fontes Capital headquarters building on Faria Lima, a building of glass and steel, modern without unnecessary ostentation, with the company logo engraved in brushed metal on the facade, discreet even in architecture, like someone who does not need to shout to be heard. The businesswoman Beatriz Fontes rarely appears at public events. The reporter spoke with that urgency of morning live broadcasts, and little was known about her personal life. According to sources close to the company, she always preferred that the results speak for themselves. The IPO marks a new phase for the holding which should... Renato turned off the volume. The silence was heavy. He walked to the window. Down there, São Paulo functioned with its usual indifference. Cars, people, the distant noise of a city that never stops moving. And somewhere in that city, Beatriz was starting her Thursday like any other day. The realization came slowly, like water infiltrating through a crack. Not all at once, not with a snap, but each fragment of the previous night began to reposition itself in his memory with a different meaning than what it had seemed at the time. Her posture at the table, the way she had read each page of the documents without urgency, the firm signature without hesitation, and the sentence before leaving, said with that strange calmness that he had interpreted as resignation, but which he now understood was something else entirely. She knew everything, and she had gone to that dinner anyway, not to negotiate, not to plead nor to confront. She had gone to sign, to close, to leave. The beige envelope was still on the dinner table, where he had forgotten it the night before. Renato picked it up, looked at Beatriz's signature on the last pages. A firm handwriting, without flourishes, without the type of signature that people develop when they want their name to seem important. Just the signature of someone who always knew who she was and never needed to prove it to anyone else. The phone vibrated again. Fabio calling this time. "Renato, you need to call Marcello. Marcello from the legal consultancy. We need to understand if the agreement is still valid, if she—" "The agreement is valid," said Renato. "She signed. It was she who wanted to sign. But do you understand what this means? She gave up any right over—" "I know what it means, Fabio." There was a pause on the line. "She deceived us," said Fabio, with the anger of someone trying to turn humiliation into an accusation. Renato remained silent for a moment. He looked again at the envelope, thought of the sentence she had said before leaving, thought of the smile his family had given afterwards, certain and satisfied and completely wrong. "No," he replied, more to himself than to his brother. "She never deceived anyone." And it was this realization, more than anything else that morning, that remained weighing heavily. The 14th floor of the Fontes Capital building on Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima was different from everything that existed below it, not because of the decoration, which was functional and stripped down, without the excess of glass and leather that executive offices usually use as a language of power. It was different because of the quality of the silence. In there, silence was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of concentration. The people who worked on that floor walked with purpose, spoke when necessary, and the only voice that always arrived with clarity was Beatrice's. She had arrived at 8 in the morning, as always. The receptionist, a girl named Priscilla, who had worked there for 6 years, noticed that the boss had the same expression as any other Thursday. Neither lighter nor more tense. The same. This, in itself, was already an answer to the questions Priscilla didn't know if she could ask, because the office was already buzzing when Beatrice crossed the main entrance. The monitors on the desks displayed the news channel. 2 analysts talked in low voices near the pantry. The financial director, Eduardo Sampaio, a 51-year-old man with grey hair and the kind of calmness that comes from having crossed real crises, waited near the meeting room with a folder in hand and an expression that said a lot without needing words. "The coverage started earlier than we expected," he said, following Beatrice's step toward her room. "The international channel picked it up before 7. "It was scheduled for tomorrow," she replied. "The NYSE confirmation leaked last night. We think it was someone from the coordinating bank. It doesn't matter." She opened the door to the room and entered without stopping her pace. "The result is the same. It anticipated by 1 day, not a month." Eduardo entered behind her and closed the door. Beatrice's room had a floor-to-ceiling window with a view of Faria Lima, and at that hour the avenue was already congested as usual. São Paulo never waited for anyone. "The calls have already started," he said, placing the folder on the desk. "Investors, press, 2 ministries, and the communications office wants to know if you're going to give interviews. The note we prepared is sufficient for today." She sat at the desk and opened the laptop. "The interviews follow the schedule we planned for next week." Eduardo nodded, but he remained standing, which meant there was more. "There's something else," he said, his voice a tone lower. "It has already reached me that some outlets are trying to find information about your personal life, the divorce." Beatrice did not look up from the monitor. "Let them come. There is nothing I need to hide, and nothing they can use." "Are you sure that signing yesterday was the right moment?" She stopped, looked at Eduardo. He was one of the few people in the world to whom she allowed this kind of question, not because she needed validation, but because Eduardo had been by her side since the beginning, when Fontes Capital was just a name on a piece of paper and an initial capital that most people would consider insufficient for anything serious. "It was the exact moment," she said. "Nothing of what was signed yesterday changes anything of what we built. The corporate structure guaranteed that years ago. You know that." "I know, I just want to be sure you're okay." Beatrice looked at him for a second longer than usual. It was a form of gratitude she didn't express with many words. "I am," she replied. "Have the coffee sent up and pass me the agenda for today's meetings." Eduardo left. Beatrice remained alone for a few minutes, which was rare on that floor. She took the opportunity to look out the window. Outside, São Paulo moved with its characteristic brutality, indifferent to what happened on the upper floors. It was exactly that which she had always appreciated about the city, indifference as a form of freedom. Here, no one stopped to ask who you were. You simply functioned or you didn't. And she had functioned. But there was a cost to that which no balance sheet accounted for. She knew that better than anyone. 15 years ago, when she had accepted Renato Drummond's marriage proposal, she was still in the early stages of building the holding. It was no secret that she worked, that she had clients, that she traveled. What had been consciously kept out of the conversation was the scale, not out of dishonesty, but because she had learned early on that certain truths told at the wrong moment change the way people see you before they truly know you. And Renato had known her, or had had the opportunity. She closed her eyes for a moment, not out of sadness. It was a kind of inventory. 15 years were not erased by a signature, nor by a morning of news. They were 15 years of meals, of trips, of shared decisions, and of others she had made alone at 3 in the morning while he slept. 15 years of a life that had been real, even if built on a fundamental misconception that he had chosen her, and not an idea of what she should be. The phone on the desk rang. It was Priscilla. "Beatrice, sorry for the interruption. There is a call on the external extension. The person says she is your sister." Beatrice opened her eyes. "Put it through." Marina's voice arrived even before the silence of the connection ended. "Bay, I'm seeing everything here. How are you?" "Well." "You know that well is not an answer, right?" "It's the answer I have now." A pause. Marina was 6 years younger and had inherited from the same family the capacity to understand what words did not say. "Did he call you?" "No." "He will call. Perhaps." "And when he calls?" Beatrice looked again at the window. A bus stopped at the traffic light down there, a woman waiting on the sidewalk with a bag on her arm. The small life that always happens while the big stories are resolved on higher floors. "When he calls," Beatrice said, with that calmness that Marina knew and that sometimes scared her, "I will hear what he has to say, and I will answer with the truth, as I always did." "You were never completely honest with him, Bay." "I was honest about who I am. What he chose to see or not see was his decision." There was a longer pause this time. "You are hurt," Marina said softly. "I am free," Beatrice replied. And there was a difference between the two things that she already knew since the previous night, sitting at that dinner table while the Drummonds built their last scene of superiority. Hurt belonged to the past. Freedom belonged to the now, and the now had already begun. Renato Drummond spent the entire morning trying to find something to do. This discovery, that he didn't know what to do with himself when the plan he had built began to show its cracks, was more uncomfortable than anything else the morning had brought. He had called Fabio, then his personal lawyer, then a friend from the golf club who worked in the financial market and could confirm, from a technical perspective, what the television was saying. Each conversation ended with more information than the previous one, and all pointed in the same direction, which was, fundamentally, that Beatrice Fontes was not who they had decided she was. Fontes Capital was real, the 11 countries were real, the value of the IPO was real, with analyses from international banks to corroborate every number. And the hardest thing to process, the company existed since before the marriage. Beatrice had entered that relationship already being who she was. She had left being exactly the same person. What had changed was only the willingness to continue maintaining a structure that had stopped working. At 11 in the morning, Renato was in his office on the 32nd floor of a building also on Faria Lima, about 800 meters from the Fontes Capitol building. This geographical proximity that he had never noticed now seemed like an irony the size of São Paulo. The door to the room opened. It was Tatiana, his assistant for 4 years. "Renato, the HR director of Vasconcelos and Associados, returned the call. She says that—" "Cancel it." Tatiana hesitated. "Is everything okay?" "Cancel the afternoon meetings." He looked at her. "And if anyone calls asking for me, say I'm in an external meeting." Tatiana left without asking anything else, which was one of the reasons why he had hired her. Renato remained alone. He turned the chair slightly to look out the window. São Paulo spread out in all directions with that peculiar insolence of a city that grew without planning and learned to function like that anyway. He had been born in this city. He had built his career here. He believed he knew it well enough to understand how things worked, who had power, who didn't, how success was measured and by whom. He had erred in at least one fundamental part of that calculation. The problem, he was beginning to realize, was not just the revelation itself, it was what the revelation revealed about him, about how he had looked at Beatrice, about what he had decided to see and what he had chosen to ignore. He thought of the first time he had seen her. It was a corporate reception 16 years ago in a hotel in Jardin. She was in a simple black dress without excessive jewelry, with a glass of mineral water in her hand, listening to a conversation instead of leading it. There was something about her that had intrigued him exactly because of that. The stillness. It was unusual in that environment where everyone competed for an audience. He had approached. She had responded with intelligence and precision to everything he said, without trying to impress, without playing the game everyone played in that type of event. And he had thought, with the silent arrogance of someone who had never examined her, she is different. Different, he had concluded, for being simple, direct, without the ambitions he associated with the women he knew in the corporate world, but different was not synonymous with simple. And he had mixed the two things for 15 years. The phone on the desk had 12 unread notifications, some from Fabio, one from Donna Lourdes, 3 from work contacts who had certainly already seen the news and were connecting the dots. He ignored them all. He opened, instead, the photo camera, scrolled back without a specific destination, just looking. Photos of trips they had taken together, Rio de Janeiro, Lisbon, Buenos Aires. Photos of dinners. A photo of Beatriz in front of the sea, in Trancoso. With that look he had never been able to completely define, but which now, with everything he knew, he was beginning to understand. It was the look of someone who is present in the moment, and at the same time beyond it, who savors what is real without needing the real to be all that exists. He had interpreted that as distance, as emotional coldness. It had been perhaps the exact opposite. The phone vibrated with a news notification. A headline from a major finance portal, Beatriz Fontes, the businesswoman who built an empire away from the spotlight. He clicked without meaning to, and the article opened. There was a photo of her leaving the Fontes Capital building that morning. The same woman, the same face, the same eyes, but framed in another way by the world. Suddenly, she seemed completely different from any image he had kept of her. It wasn't she who had changed. It was the lens. Renato put the phone down, leaned his head on the back of the chair and stared at the ceiling for a time he couldn't measure. Inside him, something he didn't yet know how to name properly was moving, a discomfort that wasn't anger and wasn't sadness, but had elements of both mixed with something harder to admit. Regret. Of the kind that has no simple solution, because what was done cannot be undone. The comments at the dinner table, the years of veiled condescension, the way he had let his mother and siblings build a narrative about Beatrice without ever having the decency to question that narrative. And the heaviest part of all, it had been she who had chosen to leave in silence. She had had all the tools to humiliate him, to publicly expose the situation in a way that would leave him in a ridiculous position before anyone who knew them. And she hadn't used any of them. She had signed, said a single enigmatic sentence, and left. At 2 in the afternoon, after hours without being able to concentrate on anything useful, Renato picked up his phone and opened the conversation with Beatriz. The last text exchanged between them was from 15 days ago, something about a condo bill. Before that, there was a sequence of practical and functional exchanges that, looking now, didn't seem like the conversation of a couple, but the correspondence of 2 partners who had already resigned themselves to the distance. He started typing, stopped, deleted, started again, stopped again. There was nothing to say that was sufficient. There were no words that could cover the size of what had passed. And perhaps that was, finally, the first honest conclusion he had reached that morning. He put the phone down without sending anything. Outside, São Paulo continued indifferent, and at some point on that horizon of concrete and glass, Beatriz Fontes was conducting her Thursday, without needing any response from him to move forward. The following week was one of those in which São Paulo seems to feed on itself. Every portal, every economy column, every market analysis program brought Beatriz Fontes from some different angle. The IPO of Fontes Capital had awakened a voracious appetite in the media for a character who until then had achieved the improbable feat of being relevant without being visible. The articles went deeper as the days passed. Beatriz's trajectory was reconstructed in parts. Born in Ribeirão Preto, daughter of an agricultural company accountant and a mathematics teacher, she had studied administration at USP with a partial scholarship and completed it with part-time jobs. Her first years in São Paulo were in financial consulting for small and medium-sized companies, the type of work no one looks at as glamorous, but which builds brick by brick an understanding of how money works in practice, outside of classroom models. Fontes Capital had emerged as a participation holding after she identified, at age 28, a window of opportunity in the logistics infrastructure sector that no one in the market seemed to have perceived with the same clarity. The first major investment had been risky, and she had slept little for months, but it had worked. And after the first, the second became easier to structure. And after the second, the logic had begun to multiply. None of these articles mentioned Renato Drummond by name. Some outlets cited in a peripheral way that she had recently separated, but without details. Fontes Capital's communications office had been efficient in keeping the focus on business aspects, and Beatriz had given exactly one interview to the country's largest circulation newspaper, in which she answered questions about the company with the precision of someone who had thought about each answer before needing it. Marina had kept all the articles. There was a notebook on the living room table of her apartment in Pinheiros, with printed digital clippings, underlines, and notes, because Marina processed the world that way. When Beatriz arrived for Saturday lunch, the notebook was strategically visible. "Did you read all that?" Beatriz asked, sitting at the table while Marina put the rice to heat. "Are you still surprised that I do this?" "No." Beatriz looked at the notebook without picking it up. "I'm just evaluating the level of obsession. It's informal journalistic research." Marina came with 2 plates. "And you should be more impressed with yourself. Most people will never appear in these articles like this. Most people are smarter than I am on that point. Notoriety is a responsibility. And a protection, sometimes." Beatriz looked up. Marina was right, and they both knew it. While Beatriz operated in invisibility, she had managed to build without the interference and parasites that success usually attracts. But the IPO required a public face. NYSE regulations demanded transparency about the company's leadership. It was a necessary movement, and she had prepared for it with the same methodology she had applied to any other strategic decision. What there was no way to completely prepare for was the human aspect, the way people around you change when the equation changes. "Mom called," Marina said, serving beans carefully. "She wanted to know if you needed anything." "She doesn't need to worry. She's a mother. Worrying is the final product." Beatriz smiled slightly. It was one of the smiles she didn't use on the 14th floor. It was the smile of Bay, the one from Ribeirão Preto, the one who had learned to do math before the other boys in the class, and who had cried hidden when her father lost his job and they had to sell the car. "How are you really?" Marina asked, sitting in front of her. Beatriz picked up the fork. "I'm resolving it. That's different from being well." "I know." The two ate for a moment in silence. It was the type of silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill the space to remain present. "Did he call?" Marina asked. "No." "He will call." "You already said that." "Because it's true. Men like Renato need to close chapters with their own words. They can't stand it when someone closes the chapter for them." Beatriz considered that for a moment. "Perhaps, but what he says doesn't change anything of what is already decided." "I know. But it changes something for you, Be, even if it doesn't change the result." It was this inconvenience of having a sister who knew her before any other role she had assumed. Marina was not impressed by the Beatriz of Fontes Capital. She knew the Beatrice who had slept in the room next to hers for 18 years, who had cried in the bathroom when she didn't pass the first time for college, who had eaten instant noodles for months in Sao Paulo without telling anyone because she didn't want her mother to worry. Marina knew the layer beneath all the other layers, and it was impossible to feign absolute serenity in front of someone like that. "He didn't know how to see me," Beatrice said, with a voice lower than usual, "and I kept waiting for too long for him to learn." "Why did you stay so long?" Beatrice put down the fork. She looked at the notebook on the table, at the articles, at the photos of her in interviews, at the numbers that had become public. She thought of how many times she had arrived home after a decision that had moved tens of millions of reais and found Renato watching soccer, which was his legitimate choice but which had never been accompanied by a real question about her day. "Because I thought there was something there," she replied honestly. "And because failing in that kind of evaluation is human, even for those who get it right in other contexts." Marina reached her hand across the table and touched her sister's arm for a second. It had been their gesture since they were little, short, direct, without excess drama. "What comes now?" Marina asked. "What always comes? Work." Beatrice resumed her fork. "We have 3 acquisitions under analysis. A partnership with a European fund that needs to be closed by the end of the quarter, and the board will need double the attention now that we are a public company." "And personally?" Beatrice considered. "Personally," she said, with a lightness that had cost her to learn. "I'm going to eat these beans, which are excellent. Then I'm going to take a walk in the park. And then I'm going to sleep without looking at the clock at 3 in the morning." Marina laughed, and Beatrice too. And for a few minutes, between the rice and the beans and the view of the apartment in Pinheiros, the most complex story of her life stayed suspended, replaced by the simple noise of 2 sisters having lunch on a Saturday. But outside, São Paulo didn't stop. And at some point in the city, the Drummonds tried to reorganize a narrative that had completely collapsed without anyone having asked them to build it that way. Renato's call arrived the following Tuesday at 18:42. Beatrice was leaving a meeting when the phone vibrated in her blazer pocket, and she saw the name on the screen for a second before deciding to answer. "Beatrice. Renato." There was a pause. She waited, with the patience of someone who knows the pause belonged to him. "Do you have time to talk?" Renato's voice had a different texture than usual, less the polish of an executive accustomed to leading meetings, more something he probably hadn't recognized in himself for a long time. "I have 15 minutes, she said. "Then I have a call with Lisbon." 15 minutes. He took a deep breath. "Can it be in person?" Beatrice stopped in the hallway. Priscilla was passing through the reception with a stack of documents and cast a discreet look in her direction, to which she responded with an almost imperceptible gesture that she was fine. "Where?" Beatrice asked. Renato suggested a cafe in Itaim, neutral, public, without the symbolic weight of either of their apartments. It was a choice that revealed more awareness than she had expected from him at that moment. They met 40 minutes later. Beatrice arrived first and ordered a coffee. Renato arrived 2 minutes late, which for him was atypical. He was in a different suit than the one he used on workdays, a choice that also said something. He sat in front of her. For a moment neither of them spoke. It was the first time they were in the same space since the dinner, and the weight of that night still occupied the air between them like something physical. "I wanted to apologize," he said. Beatrice observed him. She said nothing. "Not just for the dinner," he continued, "for the entire dinner, for the whole situation, for how my family behaved." He paused. "For how I behaved, for much longer than one night." "Renato, let me finish." It was a request, not an interruption. "I needed a few days to organize what I want to say because I knew that if I spoke before that it would come out wrong." Beatrice put down her cup, crossed her hands over the table, gave him the space. "I looked at you for 15 years and decided what you were before asking." Renato's voice had a firmness that seemed to cost him. "I let my family build an image of you that I never questioned, because it was convenient for me. Because if you were what they said, then I was what I imagined myself to be." He looked at the table for a second and then back at her. "And I wasn't." Beatrice did not respond immediately. There was something in that she needed to let settle before speaking. "You knew I worked," she said carefully. "You always knew." "I knew you worked. I didn't know what you were building." He leaned his body slightly forward. "But the problem isn't just that. The problem is that I never asked. I never had real curiosity for what you did. I treated your work as a tolerated hobby." He made a pause. "And that I can't justify with any information I had or didn't have." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. "Why were you asking me for a divorce?" she asked, with a directness he didn't expect. He stayed quiet. "Vanessa," he said, finally, with a voice that recognized the weight of it. "I had been seeing her for 6 months, a colleague from the office, and I had decided that I wanted to move on." Beatrice did not show surprise, and Renato realized at that instant that she probably already knew, not in the same way he had discovered Fontes Capital, not through television or headlines, but the way that people who pay attention always know, by the small changes in behavior, by the times that don't match up, by the eyes that avoid. "So you knew," he said. "I suspected," she replied. "But that wasn't what mattered to me. What mattered to me was that we had already lost each other long before Vanessa. The honesty of that weighed more than any accusation." "Yes," he admitted. "It's true." The coffee grew cold between them while São Paulo continued outside, in the rhythm that never stops, with people passing on the sidewalk, cars in line, lives crossing and uncrossing with the haste the city demands. "I didn't reveal the scale of the company during all those years," Beatrice said with a balanced voice, "because I learned early on that certain truths change how people treat you before they know you. But that is not excuse enough for 15 years of silence. I should have tried to show you who I was in a different way, and I didn't try." "Why?" she considered. "Because a part of me knew it wouldn't work, and I preferred to continue than to confirm it. It was a confession that cost her." He recognized that. "We were two cowards in different ways," Renato said, with a simplicity that did not try to absolve itself. Beatrice looked at him, and for the first time since the dinner, there was something in the space between the two that was not resentment nor calculated distance. It was the recognition of two people who had erred, each in their own way, within something that had been real, even if it hadn't lasted. "The agreement remains valid," she said. "I don't want anything of what was agreed that night, the apartment in Perdizes, the car. None of that. You can keep what you want." Renato opened his mouth to say something. "It's not generosity," she anticipated. "It's that I don't need it. And I never needed it." "I know," he swallowed. "That is exactly what I needed days to understand." Beatrice picked up her bag. She left a folded note on the table to pay for both coffees without a dramatic gesture, just the habit of someone who does not leave a pending bill. "Take care, Renato," she said, standing up. He stayed seated for a moment, looking at her as she prepared to go. There was something he still wanted to say, but that he realized he didn't have the right words to formulate. Perhaps because the right words didn't exist. Perhaps because some things are only understood after time passes. "Beatrice," he called, before she moved away. She stopped, looked back. "Those who diminish others are never prepared to deal with the truth." He repeated the words she had said to the reporter in the interview. "It took a few days for me to understand that you were talking about us too." Beatrice stared at him for a second. "I was talking about everyone," she said, "including myself." And she left. The cafe was empty of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't, and Renato stayed sitting looking at the street, understanding finally that the chapter had been closed with the precision of someone who knew exactly when and how to do it. Donna Lourdes Drummond had never been the type of person who admits being wrong easily. At 73 years old, she had built around herself an armor of certainties that she called values and that the people closest to her recognized as rigidity. She had educated her children in that logic, had maintained her marriage within it for decades, and had evaluated the people who entered the family with the coldness of someone who decides what has value before opening it for examination. Beatrice had been classified from the beginning. Without apparent large family wealth, without the name that meant something in the circles Donna Lourdes frequented, without the pedigree history that, for her, distinguished what was solid from what was provisional. Beatrice's work had been tolerated as an occupation, never as an identity, and when the marriage had started to show cracks, she had assumed, with the naturalness of someone who doesn't question their own conclusions, that the fault lay with the woman who had never completely belonged to that world. Thursday morning had knocked down that structure with the brutal efficiency that only facts are capable of exercising. She had not slept well in the following nights, and she had not said that to anyone because admitting insomnia was admitting disturbance, and disturbance was admitting that something had shaken what should be unshakable. On Wednesday afternoon, 10 days after the dinner, Donna Lourdes asked the driver to take her to the apartment in Perdizes. Not her own, not Renato's. Beatrice's. The one that had been part of the divorce agreement, and that Beatrice had, according to Renato, formally refused through a letter to the lawyer. She was not announced. She had not asked for permission. She had simply gone, as she had always done, with the certainty that the world organized itself according to her presence. The intercom rang and Beatrice answered. There was a 3-second silence when she heard her mother-in-law's voice. "Can I come up?" Donna Lourdes asked, with a voice that had something different from the usual. It wasn't supplication, which would be impossible for her. It was something else, a kind of doubt about her own right to be there. "You can," said Beatrice. The apartment in Perdizes was different from what Donna Lourdes had expected. It wasn't that of a woman who had been left behind. It was clean, organized, with books on shelves and plants that indicated someone cared about the maintenance of daily life. There were work papers on the living room table, an open laptop and a half-finished cup of coffee. The place of someone who works at home on weekends, not out of obligation, but by choice. Donna Lourdes entered, looked around, and said nothing for a moment. "Do you want to sit?" Beatrice asked. The mother-in-law sat on the sofa with the usual posture, but there was something different in the tension of her shoulders. Beatrice sat in the chair opposite and waited. She had learned over 15 years that with Donna Lourdes it was always better to wait. She would reach the point in her own time, not in anyone else's time. "I saw the articles," the mother-in-law said finally. "I read some of them. I know. There were things there I didn't know. Yes." Donna Lourdes looked at her hands. It was an uncommon gesture. She used to keep her gaze fixed on people as a form of control. "I didn't come to apologize," she said. "I know that too. I'm not good at it. I know." The mother-in-law raised her eyes. "But I came to say that I was unfair to you." The words came out slowly, with the care of someone who is carrying something heavy and needs to set it down without breaking it. "I didn't know how to see you, and I contributed to Renato not knowing how either." Beatrice stayed in silence for a moment. "You didn't contribute alone," she said. "I didn't help either. I stayed in silence when I could have been more direct." Donna Lourdes looked at her with an expression that mixed recognition and strangeness, that of someone who had expected a different reaction and doesn't quite know what to do with the one she received. "Aren't you going to tell me it's okay?" asked the mother-in-law. "No, because it wasn't okay." Beatrice spoke with care and clarity. 15 years of diminishing comments don't disappear because there is a business revelation. And what you and your family did that night was cruel, even if there were no company underneath it. Donna Lourdes did not answer immediately, but she also did not look away. "What do you do with someone like that?" asked the mother-in-law, with a voice that was no longer that of someone who controls the room. It was that of a 73-year-old woman trying to understand something that had become larger than she had calculated. "Whatever you want," said Beatrice, with a firmness that had no anger. "You can continue being who you always were. You can learn something different. That is a choice that is only yours, as it always was." Donna Lourdes stared at her for a few more seconds, and then, with the slow movement of someone who is not used to surrendering even to herself, she nodded slightly with her head. It wasn't a formal apology. It wasn't a cinematic transformation. It was just an old lady sitting on a sofa admitting, in silence, that she had gotten the math wrong. And for Beatrice, at that moment, it was enough. The visit lasted less than 20 minutes. Donna Lourdes stood up with her usual posture, thanked her for the time with her usual formality, and left. Beatrice accompanied her to the door and stayed for a moment looking at the hallway after the elevator closed. There was something that settled inside her with that, not a cure, not a perfect resolution, but an adjustment. The feeling that the pieces had been called to honesty, each in its limit, each in its time. She went back to the work desk. There was a message from Eduardo with the update on the European partnership, one from the legal board about NYSE regulation, one from Marina asking what she wanted for her birthday, which was in 3 weeks. Beatrice replied in reverse order, first Marina, then Eduardo, then the board, and then she opened a projection file for the following quarter and went back to work, which was the place where she had always known exactly who she was and what she was doing. Outside, Perdizes had that neighborhood life that Itaim would never have, a baker who called clients by name, a square with people walking without haste, a city within the city that existed in its own rhythm. And Beatrice, for the first time in a long time, heard that rhythm without needing to muffle it. 3 weeks after the dinner, Fontes Capital held its first public event since the IPO. It wasn't a celebration, at least not in the mold that the financial market usually uses for those occasions. No cocktail party, no guest list that serves more as a demonstration of status than of real relationship. It was a seminar, 2 days of discussions on investments in social infrastructure with panelists from 5 countries, open to professionals, researchers, and representatives of third sector organizations. It had been Beatrice who had insisted on this format when the communications team presented other options. "A party celebrates the past," she had said in the planning meeting. "This celebrates what we are going to build." Eduardo had noted the sentence without comment. It was the kind of thing he had already learned, over 14 years, not to discuss. The event took place in a convention center in the expanded center of São Paulo, and the 2 days were dense. Beatrice led the opening with a 40-minute talk that didn't have the tone of a corporate speech. It was closer to a class, with data, concrete examples, questions she herself raised without giving ready answers. The auditorium stayed in silence of the kind that indicates real attention, not courtesy. At the end of the second day, when the chairs began to empty and the organizing team collected the materials, Beatrice stayed for a moment on the empty stage. It was a habit she had developed over the years, staying for a few minutes in spaces after people leave, as if she needed the silence to consolidate what had happened in them. Eduardo approached from the side aisle. "How do you evaluate it?" he asked. "Good," she said. The conversation about port concessions in the second panel was more productive than I expected. People stayed past the time, that's a sign. "Yeah," she went down the stage steps. "And did the European Fund confirm their presence for the next meeting?" "Confirmed. Monday at 10. Beatrice nodded. There was something different about her in those days, a lightness that Eduardo observed without naming. It wasn't euphoria. It was more the quality of someone who had removed a weight they had carried for too long and discovered that walking without it was possible. In the exit corridor, a young journalist waited for her with a notebook in hand and the kind of anxiety that the profession produces in the first years. "Beatrice, could I ask you a question?" The girl spoke fast, like someone who knows the window is small. "I'm from the Economy and Future portal. It's not for the main article, it's for a monthly column we do about female trajectories in the capital market." Beatrice stopped. "One question," she said. The journalist took a breath. "In all the articles of the last weeks, this issue of you having operated discreetly for so long always appears. Without appearing, without giving interviews. Many people interpret this as strategy, but I wanted to know if there was any more personal reason behind it." Beatrice looked at the girl for a moment. There was an honesty in the question she appreciated, that of someone who is truly asking, not building a prior narrative. "Several years ago," Beatrice said, choosing her words carefully, "I learned that when people know the size of what you have before they know you, they see you through the size, not through who you are. This changes the quality of all relationships, professional and personal." And was it worth it? The discretion? It was worth it to build the company. Beatrice made a pause. For other things, not necessarily. There are situations in which silence protects but also prevents. That is a balance that each person needs to find for themselves. The journalist noted it down, thanked her, and Beatrice followed through the corridor with Eduardo. "You had never said that before," he commented, in a low voice. "I hadn't been asked like that before," she replied. Outside, São Paulo received the end of the day with that golden and polluted light that the city uses when it wants to seem softer than it is. Beatrice stayed for a moment on the sidewalk before entering the car. There were people leaving the event, groups that continued conversations they had started inside, people exchanging cards, the kind of connection that happens when the subject truly matters. She thought for a brief and precise instant of how she had arrived there. Not the corporate path which she knew by heart, but the other one. The one that didn't appear in any balance sheet, that of choices made in silence, of years lived within a structure that had become too small, of nights when she had arrived home with decisions of tens of millions of reais in her head and found an environment that had never asked about any of them. There was a mistake she had made in those years. Not that of hiding the company, which had its legitimate strategic reasons, but that of confusing independence with isolation. She had built her professional life with partners, with teams, with people she had learned to trust. But her personal life had been conducted in absolute silence, as if vulnerability were a crack instead of a foundation. That was what had cost the most. The phone vibrated. It was Marina. "Your birthday is in 2 weeks. Tell me what you want, or I'm going to make decisions alone, and it won't be pretty." Beatrice smiled, typed the answer while entering the car. "Lunch, just the two of us, in Ribeirão, at Mum's house." Marina's response took 30 seconds, a heart emoji, and then, "That I can do." The car moved in the afternoon traffic. Beatrice put the phone on her lap and looked out the window at the city she had chosen, which had charged its price and which had also, over years, made her build something that she herself sometimes couldn't completely comprehend. She hadn't reached where she was by being invulnerable. She had reached it by being persistent, even when she had erred, even when she had chosen silence when she should have chosen the word, even when she had stayed in a place that had stopped making sense because it was easier than facing the uncertainty of the next. The next had arrived, and it was cleaner than she had imagined. Eduardo, in the front seat, went on reviewing messages on his phone with the usual efficiency. In the back, Beatrice closed her eyes for a few minutes, not out of tiredness, but of recognition. The kind of pause one takes when reaching a place after a path that was longer than necessary, but which was, despite everything, the path. And there is something that only those who have already arrived know, that the value of the destination is not only in the destination. It is in everything that was understood along the way. Ribeirão Preto in October has a different light than São Paulo. It is more direct, warmer, without the mediation of buildings that filter the sun before it reaches people. Beatrice arrived on a Friday afternoon by car with a small suitcase and the laptop because she had learned with the years that work and rest could coexist as long as she chose the limits. Her mother's house was the same as always, a construction from the 80s in the Ipiranga neighborhood, with the front garden that her mother cultivated with the discipline of someone who believes that flowers need daily attention to bloom. The bougainvillea that had been planted when Beatrice was 12 now took over the entire side of the wall. Time had passed through there with generosity. Helena Fontes was 68 years old and had the type of presence some mothers develop, a mixture of calmness and vigilance, as if they were always ready to protect without needing to announce they are doing so. She opened the door before Beatrice rang the intercom, which was a tradition. "You are thinner," her mother said as a greeting. "I'm the same," Beatrice hugged her. "You say that every time." "Every time it's true." They went in. The house smelled of coffee brewed a little while ago, and of something baked that Beatrice couldn't identify immediately, but which she recognized as being from Saturday, because her mother baked on Saturday since she could remember. "Marina arrives tomorrow morning," Helena said in the kitchen. "She said she's coming by bus because the flight got expensive. I'll pay for her flight." She didn't want it. Beatrice smiled. Marina and her refusals. It was a familiar language. The weekend settled in with a slowness Beatrice had forgotten was possible. Long lunch with dishes her mother had cooked from memory, without a recipe, because some things are learned in the body and not on paper. Conversation without haste, without an agenda, without the rhythm of meetings that structured the days in São Paulo. Marina arrived on Saturday morning with a bag of sweets from Ribeirão and different hair, which the two commented on for longer than necessary, which was exactly how much time those conversations need. On Sunday morning, while her mother still slept, Beatrice sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and the paper notebook she had brought in her suitcase. Not the laptop, the paper notebook which she used to write things that were for no one else. There was an entry she had started on the night of the dinner, before leaving for Itaim Bibi, and which she hadn't finished. She opened it now. She had written, "Today ends what should have ended before, not with anger, with recognition that some structures stay standing more by habit than by strength." She looked at what she had written and added, with the ballpoint pen that was in her cardigan pocket. But the habit was not empty. There was something real there at some moment, even if it became smaller than the silence around it. This is not a contradiction. It is just how things are. She closed the notebook, stayed for a moment looking at her mother's garden, a mango tree in the back that had given fruit in abundance that year, according to Helena, a stray cat that had adopted the family without being invited and that slept on top of the wall with the indifference worthy of cats, the blue of the October sky that only exists in that part of Brazil at this time of year. Marina appeared at the porch door with a cup in hand. "Already working?" "No, just thinking." "That's more dangerous." Beatrice laughed. Marina sat in the chair beside her. For a moment the two stayed in silence looking at the garden. It was the silence of Sunday morning, which has a different quality than any other silence of the week. "How are you now?" Marina asked. "For real, without the executive version," Beatrice considered. "I'm starting," she replied. "Starting what?" "I don't know exactly." It was an honest answer. "But it's different from continuing. Continuing I already knew how to do. Starting is another skill." Marina looked at her with that look of a younger sister who had grown up observing the older one and had learned to read what was behind the words. "You will learn," Marina said simply. "Probably." The mother appeared at the door with an apron and her hair combed, which was always the first thing she did upon waking. "Breakfast is ready. Are you coming?" The two stood up. Beatrice passed by her mother, who touched her lightly on the shoulder as she passed, her gesture brief and solid like a signature. Inside, the table was set with everything Helena believed a Sunday breakfast deserved. Corn cake, bolo de fubá, homemade bread, cheese, guava paste, scrambled eggs, and that butter that only existed in Ribeirão. At least, that was what her mother claimed. Beatrice sat down. Marina sat in front of her. Helena stood for a moment, looking at her two daughters at her table, and there was in her expression the particular satisfaction of people who build their happiness with the things they have around them. Beatrice Fontes's story had not ended at that Sunday breakfast. It had only reached a point where she could pause and look at what had been built, what had been lost, and what was still entirely ahead of her. The coming months would bring negotiations, the board of directors that needed to be structured for the new phase, partnerships that were still hypotheses and needed to become reality. But at that moment, the Beatrice sitting at her mother's table in Ribeirão Preto was not the founder of Fontes Capital, nor the woman who had signed a divorce with the serenity of someone who closes what was already closed. She was simply Bay, the one who had grown up in that house, the one who had learned to do math before everyone else, the one who had left for a big city, with the kind of determination people recognize only later, when the results arrive, but which she herself had carried, since always without needing anyone to name it. This woman existed before any company, before any marriage, before any dinner with Murano crystals and a hired chef, and it was this woman who was going to continue, because those who do not make noise do not need noise to exist. They already exist. They have already built. They have already decided, and when they reach the moment of departure, they depart whole, without leaving anything that is theirs behind. Beatrice picked up the slice of corn cake, looked at her sister, looked at her mother, and began another day. Dear listeners, we have reached the end of the story of Beatrice Fontes, a woman who built a whole world while the world around her insisted on not seeing her. If this journey touched something in you, be it by recognition, by emotion, or by the silent strength of a woman who never needed applause to continue, then it did what it was meant to do. Stories like this exist to remind us that the most extraordinary people do not always arrive announced. Sometimes they arrive in silence and depart, leaving everything transformed. If you want to continue on this journey of stories that move, that provoke, and that stay with you, subscribe to the channel now. Each subscription is a sign that you value real stories. Leave your like, because it helps these stories reach those who most need to hear them. And tell us in the comments, which character stayed most in your memory? Beatrice, who never needed to prove anything. Marina, who always knew the truth before everyone else. Or perhaps Donna Lourdes, who reached in the end the limit of what she could admit. The conversation continues there, and we wait for you. End of the story.